Hello, I'm Marcello Giovanelli. I'm Senior Lecturer in English Language and Literature at Aston University, and I'm going to talk to you about Wilfred Owen's poem Exposure. So Exposure was a poem that we think was written in December 1917, and it's a poem in which Owen draws on his experience of being in France earlier that year. It can sometimes be quite difficult to assign precisely exact dates of composition of Owen's poems, but we think this is a late 1917 poem, and that Owen would have gone back and redrafted this across early to mid 1918 as well. And it's also a poem that would have been influenced by Owen's meeting Siegfried Sassoon, his fellow soldier poet. The two of them very famously met at Craig Lockhart Hospital in Scotland in August 1917, where they had been sent to recover from shell shock, and Sassoon had a significant impact on Owen's literary and indeed his personal life, and a bit more on Sassoon towards the end of this talk. But the first thing I want to say about Exposure is, as the title suggests, really, it's a poem which captures the fact that soldiers at the front really were exposed to a vast degree of different experiences, and experiences here that were not just about the battlefield and the horrors that they would have witnessed there, but also about their position within the natural landscape as well, and being outside and having, of course, to deal with the consequences of the weather, particularly during the winter. And as you might imagine, being outside in the winter would not have been a particularly pleasant experience. And this is captured really in Dennis Winter's comment about the reality of war and the weather. So Winter argues or suggests that civilians contemplating trench war today would tend to think of it largely in terms of artillery and sniping action, raids and patrols. That is, we kind of conceptualize war as being about fighting, lots of activity, lots of things going on there. And indeed, that would have been the case for some of the time. But as Winter suggests, for an old soldier looking back over the years to his trench duty, however, he would remember clearly how seldom these actions interrupted the prolonged inactivity. And to him, the real enemy was the weather and the side effects of living rough. So boredom, being passive, being inactive, having to sit for long periods of time, that's what Winter is suggesting was the reality for much of the time at the front. And of course, all of this is taking place when the weather is bad, and the impact of that on soldiers is what Winter calls the real enemy. So let's have a look then at a couple of literary representations of this before we move on to Exposure, as a way of contextualizing Exposure within a sort of broader set of literary representations of soldiers and their suffering in the weather, because the weather and the state of the battleground was a really common thematic concern for writers in and around the First World War. So the first example I want to give you is from a poem by Herbert Reed called Neeshaw Goes to War. So this is an extract from that poem, and in this extract, one of Neeshaw's company sinks into the mud, and mud would have been everywhere at the front. The sheer volume of rain, the volume of bodies walking on the ground would have ended up with literally mud baths everywhere, and mud is everywhere in First World War literature. Mud in terms of the ground being muddy, but mud in terms of also in its impact on the human body. And there are lots of poems where soldiers are described as crawling through the mud and struggling to get through the mud, and the mud's impact on their very existence. And we have one of those poems here. This is quite harrowing. This is quite an extreme instance of the impact of mud on a soldier, but I'll read it to you and then say a little bit about it. So a man who was marching by Neeshaw's side hesitated in the middle of the mud and slowly sank, weighted down by equipment and arms. He cried for help. Rifles were stretched to him. He clutched and they tugged, but slowly he sank. His terror grew visibly when the viscous ooze reached his neck, and there he seemed to stick, sinking no more. They could not dig him out. The oozing mud would flow back again. The dawn was very near. An officer shot him through the head. Not a neat job. The revolver was too close. So the horror here of the soldier struggling in the mud, sinking as his companions try to pull him out and stretch their rifles to him, but he sinks and sinks and sinks, and the mud oozes over him. And the only way out, the kind way out, is for the officer to shoot him in the head to prevent any more suffering. It's a particularly harrowing image, this. But this kind of thing comes up time and time again in literary representations of the First World War. Here's another representation. This is a little bit closer to what's going on in Owen's poem. This is from the French writer Henri Barbux's Le Feu, which means under attack, and it's a novel which is based on his experiences with his squad in France. And here we get episode after episode after episode of the reality of being outside on the soldiers, and being outside in terms, not just in terms of fighting, but in terms of the weather, the climate, and the impact of the environment on the soldiers when they're not fighting, when they are inactive. So Barbux's extract here is a little closer, as I say, to what Owen is representing in Exposure, because here we are concerned with coldness, frost, snow, and ice. So again, I'll read it to you. The cold is such that one cannot stay motionless despite the chains of sleep. We shiver, we shake, our teeth chatter, our eyes water. Everything is icy, colourless and void. The silence of death reigns everywhere. Frost and snow under a blanket of mist. Everything is white. A body has slipped slightly to one side from upright, his chest and arms resting against the embankment. He was moving some earth when he died. His face, raised to the sky, is covered with a leprous layer of rime. His eyelids are white, and his moustache covered with a hard spittle. Other bodies are sleeping, not as whitened as the rest. The layer of snow only stays intact on things, objects, and the dead. Everything is white, the blanket of mist. Everything is icy. And in the midst of this, we have this image of the dead soldier whose eyelids are white and moustache covered with spittle. His face covered with a leprous layer of rime. Rime is a set of ice particles. And of course, on dead bodies, those ice particles, that snow, that ice mounts and mounts and mounts, remains intact. And the sign of someone dead, of course, is that they're covered constantly in this snow and ice. So another particularly harrowing image. And we know that Owen had read this book. We know that Le Feu, he was reading that towards the end of 1917. There are explicit references or explicit echoes of this text in several of his poems. And it seems pretty safe to say that this would have been a big influence on Owen's writing of Exposure, particularly this idea of everything is icy, everything is white. The sheer mass of the snow, the cold, and the ice that seems to cover everything up, that is inescapable. Okay? And that's where we'll come on to with Exposure. So what I want to say about this poem then, I'm going to do a little bit of language analysis now as a way of fleshing out some of those more contextual and framing points that I've raised, is I want to focus on three things, really. First of all, I'm going to look at agency in the poem. And by agency, I mean who does what and what do they do? And I think there's a really neat pattern emerging in terms of the contrast between the soldiers and the landscape that they're in. I then want to argue one way of understanding the poem is to look at it in terms of what I've called an in-out pattern, that the poem is about being inside something, and it's also a poem where being out or trying to get out is important, and there is a conflict or contrast between those two senses. And finally, I want to look at some echoes of language in the poem that come from two big influences on Owen, the Romantic poet John Keats and Siegfried Sassoon, whom I've already mentioned. And I'll say a little bit about those two and give you some pointers towards some of their work, which I think shows an influence on Owen's poem here. Okay, let's have a look first then at agency. So we're interested here in who does what in the poem. And what's really interesting, I think, is that this is a poem that's written in the first person plural. So it uses the first person plural pronoun we to describe the collective of soldiers. But when you have a look at the verbs that are attached to that pronouns, i.e. the things that the soldiers are able to do, you'll see that they are largely to do with the senses. They are largely to do with internalized states, mental states, watching, hearing, knowing, staring, drowsing. A bit later, we're told they dream and so forth. They don't do much in terms of actions. So back to that idea that we looked at the beginning from Dennis Winter, this is a poem actually where, although the soldiers get quite a bit of our attention, largely because we are the poem is being narrated in the first person plural, they don't do much. They sit there, they watch, they hear, they know, they cringe, they stare, and so forth. So the actions are internalized, and there is little going on in terms of physicality. Let's have a look at the landscape in contrast here. So the landscape is very different. The outside external world of the front, where flares confuse, mad gusts tug, gunnery rumbles, rain soaks, dawn begins to grow, dawn masses her army, attacks, bullets streaks, flakes flock, pause, renew, wandering, flakes come feeling for our faces. So not only do we have a much livelier and much more active landscape, but aspects of that landscape act in human-like ways. They come feeling, they tug, they attack, they flock, they pause, and so on. So it's the soldiers here who are not in control physically. They are, to all intents and purposes, under attack from and positioned in spaces where they remain passive to the much more explicit agency of the outside world. This is a really, really important pattern in the poem, that the outside world is agent-like and the soldiers can simply do very little but stand back and simply watch and stare and so forth. Watching, we keep awake, we hear, and so on. I think that also lends itself very neatly to the second point I want to raise, which is the sense of being inside. So here's another poem by Owen. This is a fragment known sometimes as Cramped in That Funneled Hole. And this is a poem where literally we are given a description of soldiers inside a hole that's been created by a shell explosion, and the soldiers are trapped in there. They remain inside, unable to come out, either because it's unsafe to do so or because the hole is simply too big for them to come out of. So cramped in that funneled hole, they watched the dawn open a jagged rim around, a yawn of death's jaws which had all but swallowed them, stuck into the bottom of his throat of phlegm. So the metaphor here is of the hole like a mouth. It has jaws, it swallowed them, it has this throat of phlegm. And not only is the hole a mouth, but it is the mouth of hell, not seen of seers in visions, only felt as teeth of traps where bones and the dead are smelt, under the mud where long ago they fell, mixed with the sour, sharp odor of the shell. So these men inside this hole, trapped in this hole, this mouth, not only have to deal with that sense of being trapped, but also in the hole are the bones, the dead, the smell that's mixed with the smell of the shell and so on. So it's a really, really hellish experience here. And I think we have this in Exposure as well. Even though the soldiers are exposed in the poem, they are also trapped within the world they are, unable to act, unable to move, unable to move outside of the experience they are in. Indeed, Owen had written an extra stanza to Exposure where he explicitly focuses on this idea, or captures this idea, that the men are inside something. They are trapped inside something. This is the extra stanza here. It wasn't included in the end, and you can read a little bit more about it in Dominic Hibbert's superb book, Owen the Poet. But have a look at the last couple of lines here. We wait till at our feet suddenly the torn ground gulfs for us and the door opens. So the final stanza of Exposure was going to literally have these soldiers who are trapped at the front, trapped in this space, fall through the ground, fall through into the gates of hell, or through the gates of hell into this hellish place. So being inside, being trapped, having no sense of being able to escape against the external world is an important aspect of Exposure. But along with that is the sense of wanting to be removed. And whereas I've spoken a little bit about in, I now want to focus on the out, because it's a poem that does offer, albeit in a kind of reduced manner, a sense of being able to move outside the world in which the soldiers are in. So we're given spatial directions that sort of move beyond the immediate space that the soldiers find themselves in, northward, far off, in the east, we're told. And then we have the lines 29 to 33, which I think are some of the most interesting lines of the poem. And it's here that the soldiers who are snow dazed and cringing in their holes, it's where they fall back on their dreams. And this is a really important point, because the dreams provide an, albeit temporary, imaginative release from the world that the soldiers are in, from this external cold, bleak landscape. So we're told, I mean, the language of the poem changes here. We're told that we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. And the soldiers dream of going back home. Our ghosts drag home, we're told. But when they go home, of course, what do they find? Well, they find that the shutters and the doors are all closed. On us, the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. So dreaming, which seems attractive, dreaming which seems to give the soldiers a sense of agency that they don't have in the poem, dreaming which seems incredibly attractive in terms of its ability to release them from the constraints of the world at the front, actually ends up being simply a disappointment. Right? The doors are closed, we turn back to our dying. So imagination and dreams are disappointing in the context of this particular episode. And that's important if we look at Exposure's connections to a few poems by the Romantic poet John Keats. Now, Keats is a big influence on Owen. You can see echoes of Keats in many of Owen's poems. And one of the central concerns that comes up quite a bit in Keats's late poems in particular is the idea that the world of nature, which generally, and I say generally, is seen as a form of consolation for Romantic poets, becomes reconfigured as a disappointment, as a threat, as something which doesn't console, but actually something which is just as bad as the thing you're trying to escape from. And that aligns itself also with the idea that sometimes that in Keats that dreams can be disappointing as well. For Romantic poets, imagination was everything. But Keats became increasingly aware that the imagination and the dreaming states of dreaming involved in imaginative states were often disappointments. And I think we get this in Exposure. I think that the sense of the dream, or the attempt to escape through the dream as disappointment, is a very clear echo of some of Keats's verse. The poem it most clearly fits into, I think, is Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci, where we begin at the beginning of the poem with a narrator addressing a knight in this sort of desolate wilderness where nothing grows, the sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing, we are told. And the knight himself tells us of a dream he has when he meets this beautiful woman and goes off with her, and then is lulled to sleep, sent to sleep. And in that dream, he doesn't see things that are good, but rather he sees terrible things. I saw their starved lips in the gloam is one of the things that he tells. He sees these ghostly figures and so forth. So the sort of notion of bad dreams, or the lack of release from dreaming, is apparent in that poem, and I think it comes out in Exposure as well. Of course, very famously, Owen borrows Keats's first line to Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. Keats had written, "My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense." In Owen's poem, the first line is, "Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knive us." So you have the repetition here, but my changes to our, and heart changes to brain, perhaps there to suggest the sort of internalized and the psychological suffering that the poet, that the Owen wants us to recognize in the soldiers at the front. But in Exposure, we have then a sense of this disappointment of dreams, the nightmare of the dream that becomes a nightmare, of course, the soldiers who go home dreaming of the sunk fires, glows with crusted dark red jewels, but actually that turns into something unpleasant as the doors are shut and they have to turn back onto their dying. And also as nature as this negative space. I think that's really, really crucial here, that this isn't a landscape that consoles in Exposure, it's a landscape that is threatening, and a landscape that destroys, not least, of course, because we're told at the end of the poem that the burying party comes and pauses over these half-known faces to try and take away these dead soldiers. So finally, I want to, or the final point I want to make is around a possible influence for this sort of active and agentive landscape that we see in Exposure. And this is Siegfried Sassoon's diary entry of the 30th of March 1916. And this is well before he met Owen, and there's no reason to suggest that Owen would have read Sassoon's diary entries anyway when they did meet. But Sassoon is writing in a style, I think, that Owen definitely is influenced in, and indeed on their first meeting, Owen took copies of Sassoon's first major publication, The Old Huntsman, to Sassoon's rooms to have Sassoon sign those. So there's a clear sense that Owen had read Sassoon very carefully. But I think this is the first paragraph in particular here is really interesting to read in connection with Exposure, because this is Sassoon writing in his diary and watching the landscape at the front. And notice here how the landscape is active in the same way as we see in Exposure. So bullets are deft and they flick your life out with a quick smack. Shells rend and bury and vibrate and scatter, hurling fragments and lumps and jagged splinters at you. They lift you off your legs and leave you huddled and bleeding and torn and scorched with a blast straight from the pit. So the active landscape, the brutal landscape, the landscape that doesn't console but destroys. We have that here. And I think this is what we've got in Exposure as well. And you'll notice at the end of the second section there, if you search carefully, you may find a skull, eyeless, grotesquely matted with what was once hair. Eyes once looked from those detestable holes. So the sheer horror of the front, the sheer horror of the external world comes out perfectly, I think, here. Was presented in a poetic but also an incredibly harrowing way by Sassoon. And I think that kind of representation, which is at once acknowledging the powerful sense of the landscape, but also its harrowing effects, is indicative of what we see in Exposure. So some final thoughts then. Exposure is a poem which focuses on the entire experience of war. It's a poem which looks at the individual, the collective. It's a poem that hints at the horror of battle, but also hints at the inactivity involved at being in the front. It's a poem which concentrates on soldiers being engulfed, being enclosed in tight spaces and feeling constrained. But it's also a poem which acknowledges the sheer enormity of being outside and the threat of being exposed in an outside world which is not a consolation by any stretch of the imagination. It's a poem which asks us to think about the power of the imagination to take these soldiers beyond their everyday experiences. The soldiers do get some imaginative release, of course, from dreaming and from imaginative states, but those are often short-lived. They are temporary, and they tend to come back or to re-emphasize the bad as well as some sort of good aspects to them as well. So there is a limitation on what the imagination can achieve. And these are very romantic ideas. This is where Owen is drawing on the 19th century tradition, and he's reading of Keats, as I mentioned in particular. And in all of this then, Exposure is a poem which is about conflict, I think. It's about the personal conflict of the soldier at the front and the collective of soldiers at the front. But it's also a poem that looks at various kinds of poetic conflicts as well. Soldiers, the landscape in conflict, being in and being out in conflict, imaginative release versus the reality of the world in conflict as well. And it's also, of course, a poem that is political. Hardly anybody would read this poem and say that it's not an anti-war poem. It's a poem that's making a very clear point, of course, and we often read it in conjunction with Owen's other poems that equally position us to take a negative view on war and to see the bad effects of war. And that's not to say, of course, that every single poem that Wilfred Owen wrote was like this, because many of his early poems weren't like this at all. But here we clearly have a political point being made about the men and the situations in which they found themselves and the implications on them, both as individuals and as a collective. Thank you.